Now, all right, remember that Harry Orchard had accepted I don't know if you would call it a job, to take out Frank Steunenberg, the former governor of Idaho. And he went to Caldwell to set up a bomb to accomplish this nefarious deed. And so he had an accomplice, Jack, with him, and that's where we left off. They placed the bomb. They saw Steunenberg at the hotel, conversing with people there. And we're going to pick up. First time around, it didn't work. It looks to me like trying to avoid some of the nitty-gritty. Maybe you like the nitty-gritty of this, but last time we had a lot of recording of evil deeds that he had done, and we want to focus mostly on how God made him again. But he did plant a bomb at Steunenberg's home on the outside, and we're going to pick up on page 79. The next afternoon, Saturday, December 30, I was playing cards a little before dusk when the game was over, and I walked into the lobby of the hotel where he was staying and saw Steunenberg sitting there engaged in conversation with someone. I quickly went up to my room, picked up the bomb. Now he's going to put a new bomb there. Wrapped it up in newspaper, put it under my arm, and went downstairs. He was still in the lobby, but preparing to leave. I hurried out to his residence by a back route and placed the bomb close to the side gate post. I tied a fish line to a screw eye in the cork and around a picket of the gate. This was so contrived that when the gate opened, it would pull the cork out of the bottle, let the acid run out, thus setting off the caps and the bomb. It was arranged that if he did not open the gate wide enough to pull the string, he would still strike the cord with his foot as he walked through. Either way would be equally effective. It was a cold, blustery day, and there was considerable snow on the ground. After laying a paper over the bomb, I covered it with snow. On my return to the hotel, I passed Steunenberg on his way home, and I hurried as fast as I could, hoping to get there before the bomb went off. But about a block and a half away, I heard the explosion. It rocked the supper dishes on the tables of Caldwell and was heard miles away. Arriving at the hotel within a couple of minutes, I went into the bar room, found the bartender alone, and called for a drink. He asked me to help tie up a package, and we talked together. Then I went upstairs to my room and came right down to dinner. Everybody was talking about Steunenberg's being blown up by a bomb. There was great excitement in the dining room. A hole had been torn in his back. He was carried into the house and died within an hour. His only words were, "Who shot me?" People were soon scouring the town for a possible clue, and all strangers were subject to a strict examination. They soon suspected me, but could not account for my being in the hotel bar so soon after the explosion, for two men declared it was not 2 minutes after the explosion that I was there. I cannot tell what had come over me. I had grown grossly careless, for some of the material which I had used to make the bomb was still in my room. Bits of plaster of Paris, chloride of potash, some sugar, and some screw eyes. There were even signs of powder on the floor. I fully intended to clean up the room carefully and to sweep the carpet, but I was so excited or unnerved that I stupidly forgot to do so, and I had letters in my pocket that would be hard to explain. I stayed around the crowded hotel lobby until 10 o'clock. In the meantime, a special train pulled in from Boise, bringing men to surround the town. Word was also flashed to all surrounding towns. About midnight, I went out to look at the Stuenberg residence with the hotel clerk. It was not a pleasant sight. On my return to the hotel, I read about the murder in the paper and was sure that I was one of the suspects. I destroyed all the letters I had in my pocket and tried to pull myself together because I had now become very nervous and tense. I thought everybody was watching me, and they were. Because of my upset condition, I still had failed to clean up my room. One of the articles in the paper mentioned that a fish line was used in connection with the bomb, and I had the rest of this line in my room. I remember going to my room and disposing of it, but I had waited so long that I now did not have time to clean the room. Even my gun, which I had carried on me, was in my grip. I had always vowed that I would never be taken alive, but would sell my life as dearly as I could if ever officers tried to arrest me. I was now sure I was under suspicion. On Sunday, December 31, I went again to the Stuenberg residence with a Caldwell man who said every stranger in town would be questioned. That afternoon, while I was sitting in the hotel, a man asked me to take a walk with him, pretending to be acquainted with me. Later, I learned he was Sheriff Brown of Baker City, Oregon. He told me that they suspected me. I replied by saying they are mistaken, and told him that I would go see the local sheriff. I did go, and asked him if he was looking for me in connection with the assassination of Frank Stuenberg. He asked me if I was going to stay in town for a while, and I told him that I had no intention of leaving at present. He simply said he would talk to me later. I then went back to the hotel, but in a few minutes the sheriff came to my room and said he would have to place me under arrest. Governor Gooding, who was now in town, had ordered him to take me into custody and to take charge of all my personal belongings. I would be on parole for the time being, but could not leave my room. Then I realized what a fool I had been to leave those telltale things in my room. I had had plenty of time to get them out. Now it was too late. They even had my gun. I would have made an attempt to get away that night, but I knew that I was being closely watched and could never make it. It was bitterly cold, and the ground was covered with snow. There was a committee investigating the murder, and I thought that I would be called before it to explain what I was doing with the material found in my room. I was figuring out how I would answer them. Nothing was said to me until the next day, which was Monday. About 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the deputy sheriff asked me to go over to the district attorney's office with him. They searched me and found my membership card in the WFM. Then the sheriff read the warrant to me, charging me with the murder of Frank Stuenberg. He said that they were going to take me to Boise, but for the time being, I was to be kept in the county jail at Caldwell. This was the first day of January, 1906. Now we have a little interlude where I think Leroy Froome has put in historical notes for this chapter. So I think I'll read some of them and you'll get a background of what was going on with these people. Frank Steunenberg, that's the former governor, was a plain, unassuming family man of thrifty Dutch heritage. He was born in Iowa and learned the printer's trade in Knoxville, Tennessee. He wanted to become a newspaperman and struggled through college to that end. He was always unique and original, with a droll humor. His only idiosyncrasy was that he never wore a necktie, not even in public. After college days, he and another lad secured the Knoxville, Tennessee Express, and Steunenberg made a success of it by his forceful and convincing writing. He then followed his brother to Caldwell, Idaho, purchasing the Caldwell Tribune. Idaho was then still a territory, but in 1889 sought admission to the Union as a state, with Steunenberg as a delegate to the Constitutional Convention. Idaho was admitted to statehood in 1890, and Steunenberg was elected to the first legislature. His strength lay in his quiet, behind-the-scenes work, not in public oratory. He continued in the newspaper business, acquiring the Caldwell Record in 1896, the same year he was nominated for governor. Though there was heated rivalry between the northern and southern sections of Idaho, his first term was without serious incident. He was reelected for a second term. Early in his administration, miners went out on strike, and the struggle became bitter and grave. The foreman of one of the mines was murdered, and appeals came for help. The lawless elements were in the minority, relatively few constituting the turbulent class. But the struggles continued for several years. In fact, there was a 17-year reign of terror which matched that of the notorious Molly Maguires of Pennsylvania. The miners' union came to be dominated by a small but vigorous group of agitators instilling discontent and magnifying grievances. On a July morning in 1892, a serious conflict developed between armed Union men and the Guards and non-Union men. The Frisco mill had been destroyed by dynamite, and several men had been killed. Martial law was declared, and an effort was made to punish the guilty. Violence reigned, and threats were broadcast. Men were shot down in cold blood, and many were forced to leave the section. The reign of terror continued through 1898. In 1899, the Union concentrated its opposition on the Bunker Hill and Sullivan mine, one of the world's largest concentrators. Bitter friction arose between the mine owners bitter friction arose because the mine owners imported strike breakers, and it was blown up on April 29, 1899. The Union men took possession of a northern Pacific freight train at Wardner, rode to Gem, picked up men and dynamite, and blew up the Bunker Hill mine. The local militia was too small to handle the situation, and the state militia was fighting in the Philippines. Governor Steunenberg saw no recourse but to ask the president for federal troops. Within 4 days, the territory was occupied and martial law was in effect. All the Union men were arrested, and 1,000 of them were herded into a bullpen, a barn-like structure, and a string of boxcars closed in by barbed wire. Troops were sent in to guard the prisoners. They were held from 4 to 6 months. The charge was made that this proceeding was apparently without trial or serious effort to locate the ringleaders. The sanitary conditions were popularly reported to be horrible, and the food bad, and families of the men were not permitted to see them. This stirred great Union resentment. That these stories about atrocious conditions in the bullpens were grossly exaggerated is the conviction of Clay. Quote, the many stories of the inhuman treatment, poor food, and shelter that have been circulated throughout the country are, to say the least, fabrications of the falsest sort. The men were well taken care of, their food being much better than the rations of the United States soldier. All these dynamite statements concerning the bullpen were thoroughly investigated and aired by the Committee on Military Affairs of the House of Representatives, and they were found to be without foundation, pure fabrication. End quote. Stuenberg was said to have declared all members of the Federation equally guilty. No man could work in mill or mine without a permit from the general in charge of the troops, unless he renounced allegiance to the Federation. Clay also has this to say about the permit system. Quote, the permit system was entirely justified in the light of the conditions that existed in the Coeur d'Alene. As rapidly as possible, men were released from the bullpen, as it was necessary, in order to free the state from further disorder, to locate the leaders of the rioting. So it was imperative that no man should be allowed to remain in that section unless he should renounce allegiance to the murderous influence that had made him part of the mob rule element. The permit system has perhaps been criticized more than any other feature of the policy of Governor Stuenberg. It has been criticized very largely because it has not been understood. The President of the United States takes oath to support the laws in the Constitution before he is permitted to take his office. Every congressman and senator must do the same. Every union man must take an obligation in his organization before he can secure a permit from such union to work. Then why, especially in view of the terrible conditions that had existed in the Coeur d'Alene, should there be any criticism of an order requiring those miners to pledge themselves to law and order? End quote. Hundreds lost their jobs, tramped the roads, and faced an ever-growing blacklist trying to find work. So the Federation said. These charges were grossly exaggerated, but the Federation leaders never forgave Stuenberg for this and never forgot. He was placed on their blacklist for future reckoning. Mrs. Stuenberg was an earnest Seventh-day Adventist and conducted family worship each morning, committing her dear ones to the care and protection of God. Mr. Stuenberg sometimes attended their worship and always encouraged the children to be present. Mrs. Stuenberg often appealed to him to yield his life to Christ and thus come under divine protection, particularly because of Western Federation of Miners' bitterness. On the very day of his assassination, December 30, 1905, the former governor was with them, as he frequently was when the Bible was read and prayer offered. He had not then made a profession of Christ, but was always respectful and reverent, though silent, during the periods of family devotion. That very morning, Mrs. Stuenberg again appealed to him to come under the special protection of Christ. For years he had received threatening letters. Twice, unsuccessful attempts had been made on his life. More recently, other threatening letters had come. That morning, he seemed deeply moved. He did not specifically respond, but arose and paced back and forth, singing in his fine tenor voice, "Nearer, my God, to thee." And I was playing that before we started, although I didn't have the mic on, I'm sorry. But he was singing, "Nearer, my God, to thee." Little did he know how near he was to the end of life's journey. He did say that he was going to give a certain sum of money to help build the little Adventist church at Caldwell. On that very day, Saturday, December 30, Stuenberg told his business friends that Saturday was to be, thenceforth, his day of rest. The struggle had raged for years, and finally the great decision was made. In his mercy, God obviously held back the hand of the killer for years. Thus it was that it was not until he had made and publicly announced his decision that his life was permitted to be taken. After the explosion, the townspeople of Caldwell quickly gathered about the home of the Stuenbergs. Citizens came forward offering $25,000 reward for the capture of the murderer. Many said it was the miners getting even for the Coeur d'Alene episode of 1899. Orchard was soon suspected. Joe Hutchinson, lieutenant governor under Stuenberg, found a piece of fish line near the demolished gate. With a pass key, an employee at the hotel opened Orchard's room, where they found a piece of identical fish line. There was also a trace of plaster of Paris. Finding a baggage check in the room, they had Orchard's trunk at the depot opened and found some of the same kind of explosive that was used in the bomb and a sawed-off repeating shotgun. There were also burglar tools, as well as various outfits of clothing suited to different types of work in his trunk. Orchard went over to the Citizens Committee, where Sheriff Mosley was presiding, and said, "I understand I am under suspicion, and I should like to clear myself." He seemed so calm and assured that many were at first convinced of his innocence. But in the afternoon, the sheriff arrested him and lodged him in the Caldwell jail. Governor Gooding and many deputies had arrived by special train from Boise. General Bell, in the Denver Republican, predicted that Orchard would confess and would tell who his Confederates were. The newspapers of Colorado, Montana, and Washington were filled with editorials to the effect that Steunenberg was murdered by the Western Federation of Miners. Detective James McParland of the Pinkerton Agency was called in by the state to investigate Orchard. Senator Borah delivered the funeral oration on January 2 for Idaho's first martyr. 3 days after McParland had reached Caldwell, Orchard was removed to the penitentiary at Boise, the law providing that a prisoner may be transferred to the penitentiary if in immediate danger. There, for 10 days, Orchard was held in solitary confinement in condemned men's row, with no one permitted to see, talk to, or otherwise communicate with him. His meals were handed to him in silence. At the close of the 10 days, Orchard was taken to an ordinary room where McParland saw him, read to him from the Bible, and told him the story of Kelly the bum, who had turned state's evidence. At the close of the day, Orchard was returned to his solitary cell. And now we'll pick up with Orchard's words. That little history was by Froom. Now going back to Orchard. On January 1, 1906, less than 3 years after I had enlisted without reserve in the cruel business of planned violence and bloodletting, I found myself behind prison walls, charged with murder. No bail was set in my case, and I was bound over for trial. The experience jarred and stunned me tremendously. In fact, the night after my arrest, I did the first real thinking about life in years. I bitterly regretted that I had allowed myself to be arrested without putting up a fight, and that I had not sold my life as dearly as possible and then had ended it all. I felt I'd rather be dead than alive to suffer the humiliation of prison. This was the first time I had ever been arrested or deprived of my liberty. I had roamed the world like a wild animal, going and coming at will, and now I felt like an animal that had just been caught and caged. I did not close my eyes once during the long hours of that first night as I lay in my dingy cell. All the dreadful deeds of the past and what they had brought me to came trooping relentlessly before me. My mind, my mind raced back and forth over my past. The blood of many men was on my hands. I knew that there would be a long court battle ahead, and if I were acquitted, I would be returned to Colorado to face other murder charges. Try as I would, I could not get away from those terrible scenes that strangely began to haunt me. I did not think so much about the danger of my present situation, as I did not have much fear of ever being convicted by trial on the charge. Had there been strong, convincing evidence, there would have been no trial. The citizens would have attended to me and would have given me short shrift. I was not too much disturbed about being convicted, for I knew that there was nothing but circumstantial evidence against me. I also knew that there was a powerful labor organization and plenty of Federation money behind me, and the authorities would not be able to railroad me. I had seen others in just as tight a place as I was in go free when I knew they were guilty. In fact, I had helped build up alibis that had acquitted them. These slim assurances bolstered up my courage for a time. I placed little value on my life as far as this world was concerned. It was the eternal side of life that now began to press incessantly on my mind. That night, for the first time in years, in that dark, dirty little cell, I began to be troubled about heavenly things and the hereafter, rather than about my present plight. I had often boasted that I did not fear or believe in God or a hereafter, that the grave ended it all. Oh, yes, I had brazenly cursed him and called upon him to strike me dead, and all of the other cheap blasphemies that I could think of. But all through those years when I had been outwardly denying and blaspheming God, deep down in my secret heart, I had really believed there was a God and that I must face him. That night, after years of awful rebellion against him and his creatures, I at last wondered if I could ever make my peace with him. But how? That was the question. The devil, it seemed, was also there in full force. I had not caused him much uneasiness during those wild years, for I was fully given over to him. Now I realized how terrible my life had been. During that night of agony, when the cup of bitterness seemed more than I could drain, my mind wandered back again and again to God. The devil, of course, tried to impress me that I'd gone too far. He did not seek to persuade me that there was no God, but only that I had gone too far, and that God would not listen to my cry. I had a baffling sense of frustration, and my soul became the battleground of conflicting desires and hostile emotions. I was alternately hopeful and despondent. In the latter state of mind, I was plagued by desperate aspirations and brooding fears. At times, God's Spirit seemed to be hovering near, leading me to hope that there might even be a chance still. When the thought presented itself to me, as it frequently did, to end all and finish my misery, then that endless eternity to follow would loom up before my mind like a flash. I kept thinking of the question of life after death and of life's fundamental purpose. Had I possessed 10,000 worlds, I would have given them all to be able to make peace with God. Thus I reasoned back and forth, sometimes hoping, but oftentimes desponding and doubting. The question scarcely left my mind for a moment. I remembered the vow I had made to God many years before in Canada, and how I had gone back on my word and failed to fulfill my vow. This was the first time since then that I had been seriously troubled about my soul. I was in deepest distress. Should I take the desperate leap into the great beyond? Was suicide the way out? However, my outward appearance betrayed no sign of the fierce battle raging within. Again and again I asked myself, is this all there is to life? Is there a real hereafter with a heaven to gain and a hell to shun? If eternal life is a living reality, am I to be forever banned from it? The thought came forcibly to me that if I would frankly confess my terrible sins and deeds, God might still forgive me, as he had done when I made that earlier vow which I had broken. My plight, however, was such an infinitely more serious matter that I thought to dismiss forgiveness from my mind as an utter impossibility. Nevertheless, the thought persisted and would not be silenced. I shudder now as I think back to those terrible days and weeks, even months, spent in veritable agony of mind. I did not want to live, but I was afraid to die, for I understood that death for me would be the beginning of endless suffering and sorrow. And I wanted to be very sure that there was no possible means of escape before I took that last terrible plunge from which there is no return. Thus the days and weeks passed, with my mind dwelling constantly on this transcendent question. Sometimes I thought I would fight the thing out in the courts, and when acquitted of the charge against me, I would then change my entire life and seek God's mercy and forgiveness. But in this reasoning, I could not find a single ray of hope. There did seem to be only one tiny ray if I would make a full confession to clear my soul before God. From 1,000 angles, this looked impossible, but still I clung to it as it was the only possibility of hope. Every other avenue seemed terribly dark and forbidding. When one is surrounded on every side by fearful darkness, how sweet is one little ray of hope and light. So I kept my eyes riveted, as it were, on that one little spot, for fear I might lose it. I was in jail at Caldwell nearly 3 weeks. Then I was removed to the penitentiary at Boise, for safekeeping, as they called it. No bail was set, and I was bound over for trial. This shift, however, did not change the state of my mind, except to make the struggle even more intense. I was angry when they placed me in solitary confinement, and yet, in a way, I was glad, for there I was able to think uninterruptedly and get hold of myself. I was annoyed and angered at being put into the penitentiary without having been convicted of any crime. For days I balanced on a pivot, as it were. For a time I considered whether to hurl my wrath at the officials with all the abuse of which my vile tongue was capable, or just ignore them as far as possible. I am thankful I followed the latter course, for I have never spoken an unkind word to one of the officers in all these years of confinement here. Nor have I received one harsh word from them. I should add, I restrained myself during those first few weeks simply because I thought it to be the best policy. But if God's Spirit had not been striving with me, I would surely have given way to my fury. How great is the goodness and mercy of God in extending his restraining hand while he is still reasoning with us, wicked and sinful mortals. The battle continued. For days I hardly spoke to anyone. At times I would build up a defense case that I felt sure would clear me. Then my mind would run on to that endless eternity. What difference does it make, I thought despondently, whether I face it now or plod on in the same old way for a few short years at best? Living did not appeal to me enough to make me care much whether it be extended any great length of time or not. The great burden that would not leave me was, how do I make my peace with God? Day by day and night by night, I kept my eyes riveted on that one little ray of light which appeared in the direction of hope. What a terrifying time it was! No one can ever know the agony of mind I passed through, except God and myself. I cannot picture its full horror. My outward appearance, however, betrayed no sign of the fierce battle raging within. One day the warden came in and asked me if I would like to go outside for a while. Yes, I thought to myself, anything to break the monotony. But I put on an appearance of indifference, as I had done to all the other officers. I did go out, however, and he introduced me to a man he called Mr. Mack. I had not talked with him very long before I was convinced he must be James McParland, the Pinkerton detective. I had never seen him, but I knew about him. When I had listened for a while to his story, I asked him if he were not McParland. He said he was. Then the old wild spirit of hatred again surged over me in an instant, for I had always understood that he was the sworn enemy of organized labor and that he was the rich man's tool. I do not think, however, that I showed my feelings, for I had always prided myself that I could mix with any of the detectives and not tip my hand. I conversed with him for about an hour. At first he tried to bluff me. He told me things in which he dropped an occasional word that was conclusive proof to me that he was endeavoring to weave a story for which he had very few facts. He hoped that I would give him some further clues to follow up, but I was on my guard for every possible angle, as I had not yet made up my mind what course I would actually follow. Neither was I ignorant of the methods of detectives. He told me that if he had kept the same kind of company I had kept, he perhaps would have found himself in the same predicament, but that he had chosen the right course. He said that he would like to give me some good advice if I would take it. I told him I did not object to talking to him, but did not need any of his advice. I protested my innocence and said I was being wrongfully persecuted. He suggested that doubtless I was the victim of unfortunate circumstances, but that I had left a bad trail behind me, and that I had visited the Federation headquarters at Denver a great deal. He further said that he did not believe I had done these deeds on my own accord, but that I had been used as a tool, and that I could be of great aid to the state in ending this dreadful reign of crime in the West if I would only come clean. I said I knew nothing of the Stuenberg murder and did not know what he was talking about. But he simply asked me to think things over. I again protested my innocence and declared I had nothing to think over. He said he would come see me again, and I answered that it helped to pass the time away. This chapter is several more pages, but we probably have time for another paragraph or two. When Mr. McParland left me, he remarked to the warden that whatever I knew, I would keep well guarded. The truth is that if it had been a case wherein only I was involved, I would not have hesitated so much before making a full statement of confession, but I would have let men skin me alive, I think, rather than turn traitor or squealer upon my associates to save my own life. And that if I, save my own life, if that with which I was charged would not have condemned me before the throne of God. I knew there was no escape there. I had helped build up alibis in human tribunals which had cleared several guilty men, but I well knew that such a false defense would not stand before the judge of the great white throne, the judge on the great white throne. I thought constantly of my whole succession of crimes. They overwhelmed me. During the next few days, I tried hard to come to a decision. It was not that I was too good to throw my companions to the dogs, for I was bad enough to do anything. I well knew that I had a good chance to clear myself of the charge of murder if I stayed with my companions in crime. Later events proved that there was little likelihood of convicting me. I also pictured what the world would think of me if I made a complete confession of my terrible past. I knew they would call me a traitor, a renegade, and a monster who threw down his fellows in order, possibly, to escape himself. I pondered all these things from many angles, my mind dwelling on little else. Little by little, I began to boil it down and to settle on a procedure. I even endeavored to compromise with God. When I got to the place where I was willing to confess all to God and to ask His forgiveness, then this thought arose. What are you going to do about the charge of murder of which you are guilty? Then the temptation repeated itself to wait to make my peace with God until I first had my trial and was cleared of the charge, though I knew full well that I would be compelled to do some awful lying myself and to get my friends to do the same thing. That part of it, though, would not then have troubled me a second, if only I could have gotten God out of my mind. But that I could not do. Little by little, while in this state of mind, I virtually came to a decision. Then I would think that I could never go through with it. I would be perfectly willing to make my whole life public if only I could receive God's forgiveness and then die. I wanted the earth to swallow me up so that I wouldn't have to look upon the face of man again. On his second visit, McParland spoke of what an awful thing it is to live and die in sin. Every man ought to repent of his sins, as there was no sin that God would not forgive. He spoke of King David as a murderer. He said the Apostle Paul had held the young men's coats when they stoned Stephen to death. This interested me very much, but I would not let on to him. I did, however, ask about David. He explained how David had fallen in love with Uriah's wife and ordered Joab, his general, to put Uriah in the thick of battle, and how he then ordered the rest to retreat, so Uriah would be killed. He told me that there was a chance for me, even if I had assassinated Governor Stuenberg, if I would only tell the truth. He urged that I remember the hereafter and the awful consequences of men dying in their sins. He said he believed that I had been used as a tool by the Federation, which had been a gang of murderers from the first. The Union had now gone the limit, and its structure was about to crumble. He said a complete confession would stop the reign of terror. And that's where we'll end for tonight. The next paragraph starts, McParland came to see me again. So that's the end of McParland's visit, the second visit. So let's close with prayer, shall we? Father, we're thankful. We're thankful that we know, but we haven't read yet, that Harry Orchard makes the right decision. And he makes complete confession to you and wanted a new heart and to walk with you in peace. And that's what we want also, Father. Please abide with us. Give us your peace, your guidance, your strength. And as Miss Spencer says, in the days ahead, may our faith grow so that even if all around us fall or walk away from you, we will be faithful. Give us that strength of purpose and that desire, I ask. Give us a good week in the days to come until the next Sabbath. Please keep us safe and bless us and bless our loved ones. Help them too, I ask in Jesus' name. Amen. And until we meet again, may God be with you and guide you and keep you and bless you. Thank you once again for being with us. Good night.